Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 294, The Dutch Revolt. We've spent the last several episodes covering the reign of Queen Mary I of England. But of course, Mary had a husband, albeit for a short time. That man was Philip II of Spain. Philip was truly one of the first early modern monarchs in European history. His modernized bureaucracy, run out of his palace, the Escorial, was the first thing to inch toward a modern bureaucracy in Western history. Philip was a man with huge ambitions, and those ambitions were financed by Aztec and Inca gold and silver. The New World functioned as Philip's effective ATM to pay for some of the conflicts I will discuss today. Yet, what is also interesting is how, for all of his advantages, Philip would be so vexed by the Low Countries, or as we might call it, the Netherlands. This was an age when money bought you the best military, but that did not mean that you won. Military thinkers were still very much evolving from the Middle Ages, and Philip was about to run headlong into these issues, and more. One English commentator in the 1600s referred to the Netherlands as, quote, the great bog of Europe. But he also went on to describe it as a place where, quote, gold is more plentiful than stones, end quote. According to him, continuing his statements, what is it which there may not be found in plenty? Again, referring to the Netherlands. They make by their industry all the fruits of the vast earth their own. Even their knaves are worth 1,000,000 of ours, for they are in a boisterous rudeness can work and live and toil, whereas ours will rather laze themselves into poverty, and like cabbages left out in the winter, rot away in the loathsomeness of a nauseous sloth. End quote. Love that last phrase, by the way. Might be one of my favorites. I'm going to trot that out every once in a while when students aren't, working to their full potential, rotting away like cabbages left out in the winter and all that. Now, foreigners always marveled at the wealth of the hard-working traders, the Dutch. But the Englishmen scoffed at an egalitarian nation of self-satisfied activists, where the gentry, as he writes, is scarce. He wrote furthermore that, quote, every man is his own herald, and he that has but wit to invent a coat may challenge it as his own, end quote. In this case, the English complaint would have jived with those of the Spaniards looking over a strictly hierarchical culture and a preference for poverty over labor, honor over trade, and a downright obsession with the purity of blood. And of course, worse still, the Netherlands seemed to be nothing in the early 1600s, if not a tinderbox for religious controversy. It seems as though every Puritan, every Protestant cult has a fouling somewhere in the Netherlands. It's this more than anything else, the Dutchmen's permissive attitude to faith, that would continue to set them against their Spanish overlords all the way until 1648. But as I mentioned, as troublesome as religion might be, the reality was the Netherlands was vital to the Spanish economy. Over 3/4 of Castilian wool, virtually the region's only export, was sold and produced in the Netherlands. Spain needed the Low Countries to process its wool, and Philip also had personal reasons to treasure the Netherlands. His father was born at Ghent, his grandfather at Bruges. Philip himself could trace his lineage all the way back to the Capetian kings of France. He took deep pride in the fact that he was descended from such a legendary dynasty. The idea of the Netherlands as a single entity, however, was an artificial construction. an artificial construction of imperialist powers. In 1549, Charles V had joined Flanders and Artois to the Dutch and German-speaking provinces that had formerly been part of the Holy Roman Empire, and assumed for himself the title of Lord of the Netherlands, a title he invented. Representatives of the different provinces or states met in a powerful parliament known as the States General. But there was absolutely no tradition among any of them of political unity. Disastrously, Charles isolated the intellectually and spiritually experimental Dutch from a religious tolerance forced upon him in the empire by the German princes, thus exposing the Dutch to decades of autocratic Habsburg intolerance. Had Charles simply approached his Dutch subjects in the same way that he approached his German ones, this story may have turned out a lot different. Instead, he negotiated a massive restructuring of the Netherlands Church with the papacy that was kept secret from the Dutch until it was announced. He subjected this politically unstable collection of independently minded peoples to nearly crippling levels of taxation. Philip would then continue and strengthen his father's policies and permanently stationed garrisons of dreaded professional Spanish troops known as terceros in the Netherlands. As a result, in a somewhat ironic rerun of Charles's experience with the Spanish comuneros that I covered many episodes ago, when Philip returned to Spain in 1559, he left his illegitimate half-sister Margaret of Parma as regent in Brussels, and the Dutch were incensed, feeling downright colonized. So then, in 1565, the States General sent one of the most powerful Dutch aristocrats, the Count of Egmont, to Spain to negotiate directly with Philip. Egmont returned convinced that the king had personally offered a more conciliatory policy toward Protestants and freedom of worship in general. He even had signed an agreement that hinted at further compromise. But within months, that an infamous document that is known today by historians as the Letter from the Segovia Woods, Philip wrote instructing Margaret that no leniency was to be shown to any heretic. Far from introducing a new policy of religious tolerance, he was determined to strengthen the Inquisition in the Netherlands. And to make his point, he ordered that 6 radical Protestant Anabaptists, whom Margaret had hoped to pardon, instead be, quote, brought to justice, end quote. And this is definitely the Queen Mary style of justice we're talking about here. Now, whatever Philip had said to the Count of Egmont we'll never know, probably. But he certainly appeared to have broken his word. At least that's how the Count perceived it. And it was a decision that made him appear 3 really bad things in the eyes of the Dutch. 1, foreign. Couldn't do anything about that. 2, weak. And 3, dishonest. And then on top of it, into this story is going to enter another character. A true wild card, if you will. Philip's own son and heir. His deformed son, Don Carlos. Don Carlos was, well, we would say, troubled today. Once he was given a giant turtle as a present, which bit his finger. Don Carlos responded by biting off the turtle's head with his teeth. But he was the heir to the throne, a fact which worried Philip and had worried Charles V before him. Don Carlos was already troubled when, at a young age, he fell down a flight of stairs while chasing a gardener's daughter whom he enjoyed striking with wooden rods. Just desserts, perhaps. He struck his head multiple times on the way down. He cracked his skull so badly that it was visible through the wound. Said wound soon became infected, and physicians around Don Carlos vigorously debated the best way to treat him. One wanted to cut a hole in his skull to relieve the pressure. Others simply wanted to purge him. Across Spain, masses were said for the heir and religious processions abounded. Carlos lapsed into a delirium, and a famous Morisco doctor was called, but his various caustic ointments only brought the patient closer to death's door. Philip could not bear the suffering and retreated to a nearby monastery to pray. He must have wondered privately whether the boy's death might not be for the best. Not the last time he would wonder that. But then the Duke of Alba suggested they bring out the mummified body of a priest, Diego de Alcala, locally revered as a great healer of the sick, both in life and now in death. The desiccated remains were laid down beside the sickbed, and the semi-conscious Don Carlos asked that his eyes be forced open so that he should see. He reached over and touched the cadaver, quote, after which he drew his hands across his diseased face, end quote. Within hours, a miraculous recovery had begun so that a week later, the doctors could begin draining pus from the abscesses that had formed around Don Carlos's eyes. 5 weeks later, his recuperation was complete. But the prolonged trauma had made Don Carlos's physical and mental condition worse. Philip made efforts to control his son by placing important and powerful men within his household. But Carlos was as ambitious as he was deranged. In 1565, he planned to go to Aragon and announce himself king. Only one of Philip's deputies managed to hold the boy back from that bizarre illusion of grandeur. But before long, Don Carlos would go from a headache to a major political liability, and the cause for that escalation would be the Netherlands. At first, the situation in the Netherlands had to escalate itself. That happened on the 5th of April, 1566. On that day, the beggars' revolt began. 300 armed men broke into the palace and demanded that Margaret of Parma, Philip's regent, disband the Inquisition in the Netherlands. She had no choice and so complied. One of her counselors loudly proclaimed that she had nothing to fear from these quote-unquote beggars, and suddenly this little rebellion had a name. 3 days later, these men held their famous beggars' banquet, during which they swore never to abandon their cause for religious toleration. But now things were getting out of hand. On July 7th, Margaret wrote to Philip, letting him know that she had effectively lost control over the region. She believed the problem was Protestantism, particularly the Calvinists. Everywhere, she wrote, there were shouts of "Long live the beggars." Evidently the name stuck. These groups quickly began whitewashing local churches in Calvinist style. The Prince of Orange reportedly told Margaret that the crowds would soon turn on her and she would be dead. The Spanish court was aghast. Eventually, the powerful but warlike Duke of Alba agreed to serve as governor of the Netherlands and bring the region to heel. Margaret gladly agreed to step down the following year, 1567. And so, in the spring of 1566, the Duke of Alba set sail for the Netherlands. In the meantime, Philip's heir, Don Carlos, had descended into hopeless lunacy. According to one reliable diplomatic report, quote, he walks hunched over and seems weak on his legs, but is much given to violence to the point of cruelty, end quote. On one occasion, he rode Philip's prize horse so brutally that the animal died. Another report said, quote, he has abandoned himself to such chaos that the joy among the Spaniards at having a native prince is as great as the doubts they have about his ability to govern, yet, end quote. However, he could be generous, buying the affection and favor even of the servants in his father's household. He borrowed heavily from moneylenders to gamble, and especially to lavish gifts on women, notably Philip's attractive young queen, Elizabeth of Valois. Philip did his best to hold out hope, perhaps even when all else seemed lost. He encouraged Don Carlos to attend meetings of the Council of State, where he at least seems to have behaved humanely. But then Don Carlos flew off the rails when he found out that Philip had appointed the Duke of Alba as the governor of the Netherlands. For whatever deranged reason, Carlos had come to believe that the Netherlands was his, both his birthright and his personal possession. From then on, he began an almost maniacal series of plots to seize the Netherlands for himself. He first reached out to Philip's half-brother, Don John of Austria, hoping the Austrian noble would support his claim. Philip knew about all this. He hoped that Don John would talk some sense into the boy, but that seemed impossible. No, Don John reported back. The prince was determined to rebel. By now, Philip knew he had to act. The question was whether this was a matter of his son's incompetence or treason. But the fact of the matter was, Philip now had no choice. He had to do something. So shortly before midnight on the 18th of January, 1568, Philip himself put on his armor, and I do mean that literally, got 4 of his senior ministers together, and walked into Don Carlos's apartments. He took all his important papers and weapons away, and then, calmly, Philip ordered that the windows be boarded up and an armed guard set at the door. Don Carlos was officially a prisoner in his own home. With nothing else he could do, Don Carlos turned all his violence and rage on himself. He tried to starve himself to death. He swallowed his signet ring because he thought diamonds were poisonous. Finally, after attempting to eat himself to death, literally he ate 4 whole partridges, he fell ill with a fever. On the 24th of July, Don Carlos, heir to the throne, finally, mercifully died. The court, led by Philip, went into mourning. Yet, ever since, there have been persistent rumors amongst historians that Don Carlos did not die of natural causes. He was murdered by his father, who had him poisoned. True? Well, I certainly cannot say. But I will say, if he did, he had his reasons. As Alba approached Brussels, the population was terrified. The Duke had a terrible reputation for cruelty. Now, he was at the head of an army of 10,000, with no one able to stop him. At the same time, 2 Spanish Protestants published an absolutely scathing tract, the, quote, Art of the Holy Spanish Inquisition, offering Europe an apparently authoritative account of the atrocities of the Inquisition, which Philip now seemed prepared to visit upon the Netherlands with abandon. The local nobility was so petrified that they threw their lot in with Margaret, and she managed to restore order. Margaret, sensing the situation was under control, wrote to Philip begging him to recall Alba, but it was too late. The moment that Alba entered Brussels, the purge was on. He arrested many leading nobles and instituted a new tribunal known, ominously, as the Council of Blood. A terrified peace settled across the Low Countries, but thousands of Netherlanders were fleeing abroad. William of Orange retreated to his ancestral lands in Germany, and others went to France. 11,000 weavers from Ghent alone came to England, and Norwich, by itself, allowed 4,000 Flemings to settle there. The oldest Dutch Protestant church in continuous use is in the Austin Friars in the city of London, in fact. By the spring of 1568, William of Orange, the natural leader of the Dutch patriots in exile, was able to coordinate a series of armed incursions, but he was no match for Alba, who kept the patriot army in the field until Orange ran out of money to pay his mercenaries. But Alba also resorted to the only psychological weapon he really believed in: terror. He had 2 Dutch leading nobles publicly executed for high treason in the main square of Brussels, with 3,000 Spanish troops on duty to keep order. For the next 3 years, he prosecuted a relentless campaign of persecution against anyone suspected of rebellion or heresy. The figures are staggering. 9,000 were imprisoned, fined, or had their property confiscated. As many as 1,700 were executed, 10 times as many victims as the Spanish Inquisition would execute during the whole of Philip's reign. Many more fled, perhaps as many as 60,000 total in 1567 and 1568. Then, in 1568, with an arrogance that could only be described as breathtaking, Alba erected in Antwerp a bronze statue of himself, trampling the rebellious Dutch under his horse's hooves. Making matters worse, this was all cast from melted down cannon he had captured from the rebellious Dutch. It was modeled on medieval images of the Spanish patron Saint James, the Moor slayer, riding down Muslims, and caused such outrage that Philip had it removed and destroyed. Sure, the Duke of Alba was a brilliant soldier and a strategist when it came to battle, but he had no idea how to run the subtleties of government. At 60 years old, he was an old man who quickly tired of trying to win the peace. Alba was not only an old man now by the standards of the age, but he was also sick. Ailing with gout, Alba repeatedly begged Philip's permission to return to the warmer climates of Spain. Finally, in 1572, the king began the process of bringing this aging general home, but before he could retire, the Dutch erupted in rebellion. Alba was now too sick to direct the Spanish troops in the field, and that task fell to his equally psychopathic but equally inexperienced son, Fadrique. Father and son approached the campaign of rebellion with appalling cruelty, only made worse by the riotous mood of the troops who had not been paid for months. And that's going to be the key, by the way. These Spanish soldiers went on the rampage at Melenken and put the entire population of Naarden to the sword. There could have been no more powerful encouragement for the Dutch. And when Fadrique advanced on Haarlem, he found the citizens steeled for a fight to the death. They realized they had no choice. Even children now helped to break the siege, skimming across the ice on their skates under the cover of fog to bring supplies. And 300 armed women played their part in the fighting. Instead of an easy victory that they had anticipated, Fadrique's army had to dig in during the harsh winter. In early skirmishing, a contingent of crack troops was devastated when it tried to engage a handful of armed Dutch vessels trapped in the ice. Suddenly, a group of musketeers emerged from the boats wearing skates and slipped fast and sure across the frozen sea, firing volley after volley at their veteran Spanish assailants, who skithered and skidded helplessly on the ice. Alba later commented that, quote, "It is the most novel business that has ever been heard of," end quote, and ordered 7,000 spares of skates to be made. The Spanish besiegers became so desperate that even Fadrique suggested raising the siege. But his father responded as follows, quote, "If you strike camp without the town's surrender, I shall disown you as a son. But if you die in the siege, I shall take your place in person. And if we both fail, your mother will come from Spain to do in battle what her son has neither the valor nor the patience to achieve," end quote. But assault after assault failed. In the end, Alba understood that this war would be won or lost at sea. In late May 1572, the Spanish won a decisive naval battle, and as a result, by the end of July, Haarlem had fallen. By this point, the Spanish troops, as I mentioned before, had not been paid for months and months on end, and they proceeded to ruthlessly sack the city. The garrison's throats were cut, all 2,000 of them. Any women within the city were raped. The town was devastated. Though he may have been cruel, the Duke of Alba abhorred the breakdown of any order. He ordered the ringleaders of this riotous event to be shot by their own men. And just like that, Alba and his son found themselves despised not only by the Dutch, but by their Spanish subjects as well. Moreover, these massacres, as I mentioned, and this most recent one at Haarlem, backfired. Every Dutch town now realized it had to fight to the death. It had to hold out at all costs. All Fadrique and the Duke of Alba did was make their job more difficult by showing cruelty after cruelty. Fadrique besieged Alcamar in August and September. But even against an army of 10,000, this teeny tiny town held out. Every man, woman, and child had helped to achieve the victory. On the 18th of December, 1573, Alba finally rose from his sickbed and left Brussels, never to return. On his way home, he summarized the reality of the Dutch problem for his king as follows. Quote, "The greater part of the states have always aspired to liberty of conscience, and the principle that whatever is done in the privacy of one's own home should not be subject to inquiry. If your majesty grants them freedom of worship, they will pay whatever taxes you demand. Neither side wants another ruler, but you should understand that they want you to be their ward, under their tutelage." End quote. Now, even though he was giving this advice, to Alba, any such tolerance of religion was heresy in and of itself, and the idea of diluting an absolute monarchy was anathema. As he said himself later on, had he been given the resources to stamp out heresy in the Netherlands, he almost certainly would have done so, even if he had to destroy the dikes in order to visit a flood of seawater upon the heretics, their farms, and their cities. He repeatedly complained to Philip about the impossibility of winning the war because he didn't have enough money to pay his troops. But the king retorted simply, quote, "I shall never have enough money to satisfy your greed," end quote. Philip finally understood. He couldn't afford to borrow enough money to defeat the Dutch. And in fact, Alba's war of vengeance and cruelty had bankrupted him. It is worth noting for a moment how shocking this was. The gold, and more importantly, the silver, that flowed into Europe, i.e., Spain, from the New World was a massive boon to essentially every European economy. But it gave Spain a tremendous, albeit temporary, financial advantage. It also led to the first period of sustained price inflation in European history. As Inca gold and silver poured into Europe, the prices for just about everything rose. This was also the age when international banking really took off. Trade boomed as a result of the influx of cash, and now Europeans, they needed ways to finance international transactions at a level that had never before been imagined. The famous Fugger family of Augsburg were the banking heavyweights of the early 16th century, borrowing across Europe at relatively low rates of interest in order to lend in the lucrative market at the Flemish city of Antwerp. Their ability to accumulate real money, gold, silver, and coin in the strategic centers of Charles V's military operations enabled them to dominate the market in Habsburg sovereign debt. Their bills of exchange, or as they called them, banknotes, were considered so secure that people began to treat them as though they were actually gold or silver. In fact, for the first time, paper became currency. But the Fuggers and the other German bankers were charting in their account books essentially a voyage of monetary discovery. Just like the explorers of the New World, their ships might hit rocks. They overexposed themselves to Charles' borrowing and were badly hurt by his occasional forced reorganization of his debt, and the risk-adverse Germans reduced their involvement. As a result, the old nobility of Genoa stepped in to fill the gap, encouraged by the bond that the naval commander Andrea Doria and his family had forged with the Habsburgs. The Spanish crown borrowed in two basic ways. The foundation stone of sovereign debt was juros, a range of government bonds securized in one way or another, with a guaranteed rate of interest over the life of the loan. The interest was increasingly linked to some specific source of income, perhaps a lien against what were called alcabala, which was a sales tax raised in Castile on salt, wine, and other commodities, or against the rents payable on certain crown estates. And the recovery of the payment was often the responsibility of the bankers themselves. Then there were the other type that were referred to as asentios. These were a veritable kaleidoscope of floating debt, usually agreed upon in an ad hoc basis in order to fund a particular project or campaign on which the crown paid an extremely high rate of interest for a relatively short period, after which creditors usually agreed to consolidate the ascentios into juros. Until the 1560s, the bankers who lent money to the crown largely did so out of their own pockets. But in a world awash with money, the Genoese were determined to borrow as much as possible from the tradesmen, merchants, noblemen, farmers, and even peasants from across Europe who wanted to lend it to them. They then found all sorts of ways of putting that money to work. But the Spanish crown was always the major client that drove the European debt market. In fact, Philip's government was so hungry to fund its huge expenditure that it regularly outbid more useful creditors, such as farmers and industrialists, driving up interest rates and contributing to the rampant inflation, which devalued the principle of crown debt and was also very damaging to the economy. And the last part there is the key. Certainly, Charles V and Philip II were smart men, but they didn't understand the market forces at play. The more they borrowed, the more they increased their own borrowing costs. And the more New World silver they imported, the less that silver was worth. It would be like if you went to an ATM, but every time you went, it gave you less and less of your money. Now, wars are expensive. They always have been, they always will be. Just ask the British, who won 2 world wars but lost their empire, partially as a result. Philip had a lot of money, sure, but he couldn't afford to fight the Dutch, the French, and as we will see, the Ottomans simultaneously. Of all these wars, the Dutch revolt was the most ruinous for Philip, probably because it had been completely avoidable. Moreover, as I mentioned, the Spanish needed the Netherlands to process its wool. War disrupted trade, and that made matters so bad for Philip that by the late 1570s he was essentially only able to make the interest payments on all his debts. On September the 1st, 1575, Philip effectively declared bankruptcy, the first sovereign in history to formally default on their debts. The Genoese retaliated by withdrawing his banking facilities in the Netherlands, and Philip's new military commander there complained that he couldn't find a single penny to pay for his men. He wrote to the king, quote, "Short of a miracle, the whole military machine will fall in ruins," end quote. It was quite the prophecy. The light cavalry, for example, were owed 6 years' pay, and in 1576, the soldiers mutinied. After committing a series of terrible atrocities, including the especially brutal sack of friendly Antwerp, remembered in history as the Spanish Fury, the army of the Netherlands mutinied and abandoned the coastal countries of Holland and Zeeland. The States General worked quickly to unite all 17 provinces of the Netherlands in an act known as the Pacification of Ghent, which established a humiliating general peace that required the removal of all Spanish troops and officials from both the Spanish and Dutch Low Countries. The Dutch had bankrupted mighty Philip by forcing him to keep such a large army in the field for so long. Now the Dutch had taken charge of themselves. Everything Alba had fought for, and every penny that he had spent, had gone to waste. Philip had paid a high price for all of this. The negotiations now began for the restructuring of all of his debts again. There could be no doubt that the bankers would have agreed to some solution in due course. Philip may have threatened to go elsewhere for his credit, while his activities underpinned such a huge proportion of the European economy that without his borrowing, the whole system would have eventually collapsed. But the process would have proved considerably more painful had it not been for the intervention in 1577 of Providence. That year, silver receipts from the Americas broke every record because one of the great technological developments in history of silver production, the so-called patio method, was now in use in both Peru and Mexico. With the promise of new American riches, Philip and his bankers finally reached an agreement known to history as the Medio General, which imposed a brutal tax of almost 40% on nearly 15 million ducats of short-term debt. Cooked into all this was a provision of a new loan of 5 million ducats. And so the cycle of sovereign solvency and default started again. As ever, the American, that is to say Mexican and Peruvian, silver financed Habsburg aspirations throughout Europe. The problem for Philip was that even by the 1550s, as I mentioned, the surface deposits of silver and gold in the New World had all but dried up. He needed new methods to extract the wealth that lay deeper beneath the surface. He got it, the patio method, but not until 1557. It took time for the new techniques that involved essentially combining silver ore with mercury to separate it out, and then later heating the mixture to burn off the mercury. But when it went into production, the results were astounding. Between 1575 and 1580, the production of silver from Peru was 4 times what it had been previously. But it was too late to save Spain in its battle with the Dutch. Ultimately, the Dutch revolt lasted longer than any other uprising in modern European history. In the end, it lasted nearly 80 years. It came to define daily life for generations of both those who lived in the Netherlands and those who fought there. The Dutch were fighting on their home soil. Their navy throughout the conflict was consistently more agile, and in the end it won more engagements. But really the reason Spain lost the Dutch revolt had little to do with the Dutch themselves. Philip would lose in the Netherlands because he had so badly overcommitted himself. The Dutch could afford to focus only on the Spanish. The Spanish could not. Moreover, the Spanish were standing on the beach, trying to hold back the tide. They were desperately trying to achieve what were unachievable goals. And if I'm being honest, some of the blame for all these failures lies squarely at Philip's feet. He didn't learn from his father's experience dealing with religious toleration and dissent in Germany. But worse still, he never once personally visited the region. For a man who considered the Netherlands to be his birthright, that was inexcusable. Now, as we're going to see, the Dutch revolt was not the only reason for the collapse of the Spanish Empire and the end of Spain's golden age, but it certainly did not help. Next week, we head back to England as Elizabeth I takes the throne. If you're interested in more Western Civ in the interim, you can check out the links in the show notes. Try a 7-day free trial of Western Civ 2.0 and get back in it with the Romans. We're deep into it now with them in the Punic Wars, and I'm having a lot more fun covering that in a lot more detail.